So Richard, I want to start by talking about one of your last books, which is called Dream Hoarders. And I think it makes a really interesting, convincing case that the problem in the United States is not necessarily, as Bernie Sanders used to say, the millionaires and the billionaires, but rather the people who are in the upper middle class, the people at the top 20% of society. That is not the super rich who hoard all of the dreams, but rather probably you and me, probably many of the people who listen to this podcast, many people who are highly educated, who have nice jobs, who aren't plutocrats by any stretch of the imagination, but who have built these enclaves of privilege. Tell us a little bit about the dream hoarders and why we should think about some of the problems with inequality and lack of opportunity in America in those terms.
Yeah, I think that's where the real economic cleavage is. So when I look at what's happened around inequality, it is, as you say, not so much the difference between the top 1% or 0.1% or zero, but the higher people go up the income distribution, the more they push the problem, right? It's always the person richer than them that's the problem. I don't see that as the most important cleavage. I see the most important cleavage as this one between the upper middle class. So these are folks who are measuring their income in hundreds of thousands of dollars, but not hundreds of millions of dollars, them and everybody else. So if you look at the bottom 80% of the income distribution in the US, looks pretty similar today as it did in the late 70s. There hasn't been much increase in income inequality there. It's not like the people in the middle have pulled away from the people at the bottom. What's happened is the people at the top are pulled away from everybody else. And that really starts to happen at about this top 20%, or if you want, top 15%. But this is comfortable six-figure incomes, four-year college degrees, probably married, etc. And I think that's a much more important cleavage for a number of reasons. One, there's a lot more people in the top 20% than in the top 1%. Right? There's just more votes, more power, and much more political power. So it's easy to talk about how the plutocrats have all this political power, but combined, the upper middle class run everything, every institution, every media outlet, every teacher, every professor. Like they are the professional class. And secondly, because as a class of that size and with so much more money, and they are taking so much more of the share of income, they can then do all kinds of things to secure their position. So they can hoard, and so they can rig the housing market in such a way as to exclude other people from affordable housing and from those areas. They can rig higher education by making it incredibly expensive and hard to access and pulling all kinds of strings to get their kids in there too. And so they can essentially rig two of the most important markets for opportunity, housing and education, in favor of themselves, which means that then their kids are likely to inherit an upper middle class position too. And so it seems to me that's really what, and I think that's what's driven a lot of our political divides. I think that a lot of the populist anger we're seeing is not against the plutocrats, much though Bernie Sanders might wish it to be so. It's against the professionals. It's against people like you and I. It's against people with, nice houses in Bethesda or wherever you want to choose, or Palo Alto, and kids and four-year degrees and so on. Very often the ones who, the people who are doing well. I mean, and that's a much broader swath than just top 1%. And the last thing to say is, one of the motivations for that last book is rather too convenient for people who are merely on, say, $300,000, $400,000 a year, whose house is only worth $1 million, to say, I'm not the problem. The real inequality problem is Jeff Bezos and the billionaires and the millionaires, because nobody wants to think they're part of the problem. And nobody wants to think that they might have to give up something like the zoning or the mortgage interest deduction. So it was a bit too convenient, self-serving.